This is the John Batchelor Show. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, is here with me, and it is a pleasure to introduce Mary and all of America to the author of a wonderful new book. This is the story of the rebuilding, renovation...
Gutting, John. Gutting.
Reawakening. There was a deal of artifice about this because, in fact, the White House that we associate with most of American history is not actually there anymore. But it was convincingly done, so America thought there was a cleaning up of the problems, the few problems. The book is The Hidden White House, Harry Truman and the Reconstruction of America's Most Famous Residents. I welcome Robert Klara to my studio. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening, John.
The keen anecdote I begin with. It is June of 1948. Balmy evening I picture in Washington. Beautiful evening, the Rose Garden in bloom. No one is at home in the residence part, the second floor of the White House. In Margaret Truman's room, Margaret is a very gifted young woman whom the president devotes a deal of attention to, the only daughter of the president of the United States, and she plays piano. She plays it feverishly, and she has a very good friend. And over the course of the previous year, remember, this is the accidental presidency with the death of FDR. Mr. Truman, who had been a senator and suddenly a vice president, is president suddenly in 1945. His daughter comes to the White House. We will get to the problems. But in any event, she has brought not only a grand piano into her room, but also a spinet. They're next to each other. And at some point earlier in the year, Margaret and her good friend had been playing a duet together. And at some point they'd hit a moment Robert describes dramatically in his book as a fortissimo.
Fortissimo.
They hit it hard. And Margaret Truman suddenly was feeling ill and drunken because the room was wobbling and she couldn't understand. Was she having a stroke? Well, in fact, the room was dipping and rising. But on this moment, in June of 1948, no one's at home. And there's a sound in the White House that you can only guess at because no one actually remembers what happened. And suddenly, a leg of the spinet not only breaks through the floor, it breaks through the rotted interior and then all the way through the plaster on the first floor of the White House. Robert, congratulations for recovering this moment in American history.
If only I could have been there myself, but thank you.
What created the condition for that to happen, for the spinet to break through?
Oh, where to begin? The problem was that in that particular evening was that the floors of the White House were over 150 years old. They had been replaced in 1817 after the British did us the favor of burning the president's house down. And the wood had never been sealed properly, and it had grown weak and brittle, and it was simply not enough to support the weight of one piano, let alone two, which were in the room. And at that point that you described, the White House basically said, "I can't take it anymore," and that's when the leg plunged right through the floor, past the beam and into the plaster of the dining room below. It must have made a heck of a sound. It's a pity that nobody was there to hear it.
So, Robert, the president thought that the White House was actually haunted because this was not the first indication that there was a problem with the White House, right?
In fact, this was the incident that Margaret said was the last straw. The funny thing is that there were so many last straws, it's hard to tell exactly when they got as fed up as they were. But yes, the joke around the house when the Trumans moved in, they were warned about this, is that there were ghosts in the house. And the staff, the longtime staff, were familiar with this because there were corners of some rooms that were always drafty. And when Truman would work at night, he would hear footsteps. At times they'd be banging at his door, and he'd get up and open it, and there wouldn't be anybody on the other side. The staff, being a little bit more superstitious than the president, chalked it up to ghosts and let it go at that. For a while, Truman did too. But as the eerie happenings started to worsen, the rationalist in him kicked in because pictures would fall from the wall for absolutely no reason. And at one point, Truman actually borrowed the stethoscope of his doctor and held it to the plaster of one of the walls, and he could hear the creaking as the mansion slowly pitched back and forth. You don't need an architectural degree to realize that that's something that you don't want to hear in a house.
This is 1948, and Mr. Truman appoints a committee. They look very grimly at the conditions at the White House, the foundations, the wall, what needs to be done, and what they discover is a nightmare. a nightmare that has a long-running beginning. So let's begin with that nightmare. Pleistocene period might be where we could begin, Robert, but I don't know. In any event, what's happened is that the White House was built on one of the few places you could actually imagine was a high ground in a swamp once upon a time. You described the foundations of Washington, D.C. itself as plant goo. Okay, that will create problems we'll get to. Let's go to where the origin of the damage to the White House infrastructure started, which was the burning of the White House in 1814 by our British enemies.
Frenemies, John. Frenemies.
It was a special relationship.
It turns out they rebuilt the White House, they put it back up, they celebrated, but they used bad material. What did they do?
They took not all of it, but apparently too much of it. There was so much pressure to rebuild the house after it had been burned that the decision was made to take some of the timbers that were burned but not too badly burned and just put them back in and hope for the best. And so that was one of the many catastrophic judgments that was made. You had also mentioned the sandy soil, which again is not recommended for house building. The site for the White House had been chosen by Pierre L'Enfant because it was one of the two highest places in the new federal city, the Capitol being the other one. At the time, the study of soil mechanics did not exist yet. That was a 19th century thing. And so it's not that they didn't see that sand might, possibly be an issue, but they didn't think very much of it because remember, in 1792, all they were building was a proper country gentleman's house. They had no concept back then of the sort of weight that would be going into the house in later decades. And as a result, they did not give the house adequate foundations on that soil.
But Robert, it seems fantastic that no president prior to Truman had realized just the extent of the problems that you describe. Why wasn't this addressed earlier? Is it because we were at war and there simply wasn't time to address it?
It kind of was addressed earlier to a degree. The house started to fall down. I found many papers of presidents complaining that the house was in terrible shape. But of course, none of them suggested that the place might collapse. One of the reasons for that was that it really took the coming of the modern age, of the industrial age, the addition of very heavy things like air conditioning, an elevator,
steel, concrete,
right, piping for steam heat, all of those things to add an enormous amount of weight to the house.
They put a concrete floor on the third floor.
Yeah, on the third floor. That was another
small issue.
problem.
Let's go to 1902. My notes from our conversation,
Well, that's the first time that was the first time that a president said, Houston, we have a problem. That was Teddy Roosevelt. And when he had big state dinners, everybody would go into the East Room and the floor would start to bow. And so the housemen would run into the basement and prop up the floors just in time for the party.
Literally prop up the floors.
Literally prop the floors.
With what?
Yes.
Like with a wood?
They had some kind of jacks. So what happened was Teddy decided, okay, we have to rebuild the house. He called in Charles Follen McKim of McKim, Mead & White, arguably the most prestigious firm in the architectural firm in the country at the time, and said we need to address these problems. The difficulty lay not with the architect but with the president, because he basically said, I want all the problems in this house fixed, and by the way, I'd like a new wing put on. By the way, I'd like the whole interior redone, and by the way, you have a couple of weeks to do it. And so poor McKim really could only do architectural triage. He threw some steel beams into the house. He was not able to address the foundational problems, and he let it go with that.
Let's give credit to Edith Wilson for creating a problem that was discovered only later. She didn't think the dining room was large enough, so she said,
well, this is a dual problem. The first lady villain was Teddy's wife, who decided that the state dining room needed to be bigger, and the only way to do that was to knock out a wall. The wall that they knocked out happened to be holding up a good portion of that side of the house.
They tore out a
major support wall.
Right.
McKim fixed that by putting a hanging truss on the floor above, which actually held for a while. It held until Ellen Wilson had the idea that the third floor of the house, which was kind of more like just an attic space and had been used as servants' quarters, she decided to turn that into formal living space, which meant adding bathrooms, which meant cast iron bathtubs, and more weight. So she heaped even more weight on top of, at this point, now a house that was missing one of its major strengthening walls.
I have a note here that the roof fell on Coolidge's head. What was that?
Well, the entire roof didn't fall on his head, just part of it.
Right.
Fortunately for Mr. Coolidge. What had happened is in 1927, the public buildings architect told Coolidge, who was famously parsimonious, President Coolidge, the roof needs to be replaced, and Coolidge didn't want to spend the money. This was a man who had bought plumbing secondhand from an army base to save money, and so he challenged his architect and said, well, if there's so much problem with the roof, why doesn't it fall down? Shortly after that, a piece of the roof broke off, the story goes, and hit him in the head. It's a possibly apocryphal story, but in any case, he did sign the paper shortly afterward, and they replaced the roof. What they did, though, is replace it with an even heavier roof, a steel and concrete roof, which, of course, was put on top of the inadequate foundations.
The shaky foundation.
And the bad wood, and you can see where this is going.
There are a couple of heroes to introduce. Robert Klara is here. His book is The Hidden White House, Harry Truman and the Reconstruction of America's Most Famous Residents. When we come back, Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, Major General Edgerton called home from redirecting the Tigris and Euphrates, along with a man named McShane of Philadelphia. Those two men are the reason we have a White House in the 21st century. Robert Klara, Mary Kissel, I'm John Batchelor.